NIMBYism.
Tonight, has the great Australian dream of home ownership become a nightmare? On Q&A, we ask what needs to happen to make buying a house without the bank of mum and dad possible. It's the great housing headache for experts and policymakers, including federal Labor's Andrew Leigh, whose housing policy pledges to build more than 1 million homes over the next 5 years. The Liberals' Andrew Bragg says people should be able to dip into their super to get into the market. Catherine Liddle represents the voice of the next generation, while Max Chandler-Mather from the Greens wants more rights for renters. New South Wales Housing Minister Rose Jackson says our cities need to densify, while economist Cameron Murray says housing has been hijacked by vested interests. Welcome to Q&A. I want to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose land we are meeting. Remember, you can live stream us around the country on iView and all the socials. Quandra is the hashtag. Please get involved. To get us started tonight, here's a question from Isabel Noble.
Does the panel think it is fair that some members of Australian society own multiple homes whilst other members do not have a bed to sleep in?
Cameron.
That's a great question to start. Thanks for that. I think that's the heart of the question we're asking today. And the question there is there a trade-off between having more landlords and making housing a better investment and having more home ownership? And I think there is. There is a symmetry to housing. And yeah, this is the great dilemma, but it's not a new one. One thing I often quote to people is when a famous visitor to Sydney observed that the number of homes recently built is astounding. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house. Now, that was Charles Darwin in 1836 when he arrived in Sydney, population 20,000. So it's not a new problem that we need to deal with it, but you're right, that's the heart of the issue, is the haves and the have-nots, and how is the best way to help the have-nots.
Okay, but at the heart of the question, Catherine, if I could go to you, is
Sure.
the idea that some people have no housing and some people have multiple houses. Is it fair?
Yeah, I'm not sure is it fair is how I'd answer that. I'd say it's something that we need to be ashamed of. This is one of the richest countries in the world, and yet those families that are suffering the highest level of vulnerabilities are the ones most overrepresented in those numbers. And when you think about what we're looking at in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, 20% of the people that have nowhere to live are our families. In the Northern Territory, 90% of the people who don't have anywhere to live are our people. When you look at what housing is available, again, grossly overrepresented. We're looking at stats like 34% of the housing available to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people has major structural flaws, and 20% of current housing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would be considered not fit to live in. That's something we should be ashamed of. So it's more like, is it a disgrace? Yeah, I don't think anyone could describe it as anything less than a disgrace.
Andrew Leigh, how does it sit with you that there is such a disparity?
No, I think Isabella's completely right, and it's not something that's inevitable. My grandfather, Rolly Stebbins, was born in a tent in Queensland in 1922. After World War II, they didn't have very much, but they had a federal government that was willing to expand housing policy. And under the Chifley government, and then continued under the Menzies government, they built a house in Williamstown. He and his wife Jean raised my mum and her sister and brothers in a home where my grandfather was making the bricks in his own little kiln with his mates whenever they had a little bit more money. That was a period where home ownership peaked. Not because we allowed people to rip money out of their savings accounts, not because we ran some sort of a housing lottery, but because we invested in supply. And fundamentally, the problem, Isabella, is that we're not building enough homes. We've got about 4 homes for every 10 Australians, and that's low for the advanced world. We've got to build more homes. So the Housing Australia Future Fund, the New Homes Bonus, the Social Housing Accelerator, all the policies you'll hear the federal government talking about is about getting more housing supply out there after a period where housing supply has fallen below population and home prices have gone through the roof.
Andrew Bragg, you heard the question. How do you respond to it?
Well, I mean, it is a problem of supply. We haven't built enough houses. Unfortunately, though, the problem's getting worse. So, and in the last year, we've had 670,000 new migrants come in and only 170,000 houses being built. So it's getting much harder under Labor to get the houses we need to house our children. So equally, on the demand side, for people who might have a bit of money, for example, in super, they can't even use their own money to buy a house. So basically, it is very hard to get a house when the country isn't building enough houses and we have these ridiculous rules which stop people from using their own money.
OK, we're going to get into some of those issues. Max, I really think it's important to address Isabella's question about some people having lots of houses and some people having none.
It's deeply unfair, and what's really unfair is the federal government hands out billions of dollars in tax handouts to property investors who own multiple homes. Like, do you want to know what the biggest line item in the budget for housing was in the last budget? It was $27 billion in tax handouts for property investors. That's what the government spent most on housing in the last budget. And what that means is if you are a first home buyer going to an auction, you're going to that auction and you're losing to a property investor because they can use negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount to bid up the price of housing and screw over first home buyers. It's deeply, deeply unfair. And there's a reason that both the representatives from the Labor and Liberal Party mentioned supply but failed to talk about demand.
Well, supply matters.
Well, sure, but as long as you are dishing out, so over the next 10 years, the PBO has said that tax handouts for all property investors in the budget will cost $500 billion, $500 billion. As long as the government is dishing out that amount of money to property investors to go and hoover up homes, so 10, 20, 30 investment properties, we're never going to fix this housing crisis. So our job is to make sure both those major parties know that it is politically popular to phase out negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts, and it's politically necessary.
OK, Rose?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there's very little about our housing market at the moment that is fair. And, you know, I come from Sydney, and in Sydney we have a situation where 70,000 30 to 40-year-olds left our city in the last few years and only 35,000 arrived. So we are losing a generation of young people in the great city of Sydney, and housing is a core reason for that. So very little about our housing market is fair at the moment. I think there's actually kind of broad agreement on that, which is good. The question is what we do about it.
Yeah, that's right.
And I have to say, I am of the view that fundamentally we can't solve the problem within the confines of the housing market that we have currently. We have to change, and we have to build more homes. It's not enough.
Do you think it's just a supply issue, though?
I don't. I don't think it's just a supply issue. I don't think it's just a tax issue. I don't think it's just an Airbnb issue. I don't think it's just a planning issue.
But is it all those things? Is it tax as well? Does it all have to be on the table?
Yeah, I think it does all have to be on the table. And we've got ourselves into such a dysfunctional quagmire and mess that everyone does have to come to the table. And certainly that includes state governments. And I'm not trying to abdicate our responsibility here. We've got work to do. But so does the Commonwealth, and so does local government here. And I think, sure, it's, you know, easy answers are always attractive. Yeah, talk about migrants, but, you know, this isn't Sky After Dark. Talk about tax, sure, talk about all those things. But fundamentally, we've got to acknowledge that if there was a lever to pull or a button to press and it was that easy, governments would have done it. Fundamentally, it is challenging. But in answer to Isabel's question, no, it's not fair. And there's a lot of work to do to get our housing market back to somewhere resembling a fair distribution of the housing assets.
Rose is right. This is the ABC After Dark. That gets us to the topic of our online poll. We're asking you, should first home buyers be able to draw from superannuation to get into the housing market? You can cast your votes anonymously on the Q&A Facebook and YouTube accounts, or the ABC News X and Instagram accounts. Will bring you the results later. Next, we'll hear from Anne-Marie Eastman.
My heart's just pounding from the comments I've heard. Why do politicians feel that they need to keep taxing or changing the rules for how to claim our legitimate business expenses? Owning property is a business and takes time and effort to make sure all is running smoothly. I'm just so angry that as a landlord, I shouldn't have to feel guilty about owning property or properties in our case. Why does it appear that all landlords are demonised and put in the same bracket?
Max?
Look, our political focus is on both major parties' failures to phase out those tax handouts for property investors. We have had a tax system that has encouraged people to buy up property investments and then able to write off any losses they make on that investment off on their tax. And look, I'm sorry, I just don't think that's fair. And the human consequences of a tax system and a rental system where a landlord can put up the rent by as much as they want at the end of every lease. Like, we desperately need caps on rent increases right now because the human consequences of that are the people I've spoken to. Single mums choosing between buying their baby's nappy rash cream or paying the rent. People living on the street,
Sure,
families
Max,
out of their... Well,
Wait, but isn't it the case that actually interest rates have risen as well, that some landlords actually are in significant financial trouble as well?
The worst consequences for that is selling an investment property and making a huge capital gains. I'm sorry, but I just think... like, can we just get real for a second here? 30% of this country rents, and right now, just like federal parliament, there's more Andrews than renters on this panel, and I think that really, the voices of renters continually get silenced because the interests of landlords get put up against renters as if they are equal. But they are not, because if a renter loses their home, they're sleeping in their car on the street. If a property investor has to sell their home, that might be bad, but they still get a huge sale price out of that home. I think we just need a little bit of perspective.
Anne-Marie, I know your experience is very different to that. Who do you feel demonised by?
I feel demonised by the government because they want to take away capital gains tax.
The government hasn't proposed that.
Don't worry, it's only the Greens that want to do that.
Yeah, well, there you go.
The government hasn't proposed it. It's not one of their proposals. In fact, they're saying no to that proposal.
There's a reason why my husband and I got into investment in property was because we could not see the government always being able to support us in retirement. We're self-funded retirees. We get nothing from the government. We don't get a healthcare card. We will be supporting ourselves. We're saving the government money by not requesting a pension. We're also supplying rental properties to people that do want to rent. Not everyone wants to own their own home. And as for rentals going up, our rents go up according to the market value. Last year when I did my tax return, I compared last year's tax return to the year before's tax return. Our gross rent was up 3%. Our interest payments were double the year before. We are also finding it hard. We have to find the money to pay that interest.
Okay.
So we're in just as much of a...
I want to bring you in, Andrew Leigh. I mean, it isn't a government proposal, but there are a lot of people saying it should be, that you should be looking at some of these concessions. But you've just heard there from Anne-Marie that she obviously feels, well, demonised is the word she used, by some of this discussion. Is that the sensitivity? Is that why you've been reluctant?
Oh, Patricia, we've got a pretty full tax reform agenda, multinational tax, closing down debt deduction loopholes, making sure some of the West Coast
no talking points tonight.
No,
yes, you have other things, but on this issue.
And
this is a housing show.
Everyone in the room is getting a tax cut on the 1st of July. So our tax, we have a full dance card
tax bracket in.
when it comes to tax
housing.
I personally don't believe in the politics of us and them, that kind of populist politics that seeks to pit society against one another. Fundamentally, what we want to do is make sure there's a fairer deal for renters. With more people renting for longer, we're working with states and territories to ensure you've got renters' rights. You'll know about some of the detail of this, Anne-Marie, but for many renters, I think they look around the world and they see countries where you can have a pet, where you can put a picture on the wall, and where you've got long-term leases. So we're working with states and territories to ensure that works better. But fundamentally, housing affordability is about supply. If you go back to when I was a kid, we had houses costing about 5 years average income. Now they cost about 12 years average earnings. That increase is fundamentally because the housing supply hasn't kept up with demand. I totally disagree with Max's perspective that Australia has enough houses. We don't. We need to build.
He hasn't said there's enough houses.
I mean, and can I just say, like, part of the problem here is you just actually sort of avoided answering the question, because the question, like, the question's very direct. And you just mentioned other countries around the world and renters' rights. You know what most of continental Europe has? Rental regulation, caps on rent increases. And you can have, look, improvements to renters' rights are important, but as long as a renter, as long as they get to an end of a lease and they can't afford the $200 rent increase, then they're going to get screwed.
Right,
and unless we have a cap on that, we're not going to fix the housing
I want to
crisis.
bring you in, Rose. Do you think we've got the balance right between renters and landlords?
No, I don't. Coming from a state government perspective, Andrew's right. I do look at the rental experience in New South Wales and I think it's inadequate, and I think that's the case in a lot of states. You can't get long enough rental leases. It is too easy to be evicted. You know, renters need more protections against inadequate conditions in their homes. I agree that they should be able to have pets. So no, I mean, I fundamentally don't think, as we see a larger number of people renting and renting for longer, we've got the balance right.
Do you think landlords are being demonised?
Look, I mean, it's really powerful to hear your perspective, I have to say, and I really thank you for sharing it. And it can be hard to come on national TV and talk about, you know, your experiences and the kind of, you know, force of the political rhetoric that you're experiencing. So, sure, actually, of course, I hear what Anne-Marie's saying. I suppose, you know, in response, I just ask you, and I'm sure that you do, and actually, most landlords, of course, are people who just are looking for a bit of a nest egg for their retirement. And I respect and acknowledge that and think it plays an important role. But I would ask you just to think about the experience, perhaps not of your tenants, but of other tenants, because the experiences that I've talked about, and even, you know, Max has talked about, are real. And there is a growing number of people who are relying on rentals, and they have kids and they send their kids to school, and they need more stability in the rental experience. So I'd ask you to just think about overall, how can we deliver a system that works for you but also works for them?
We'll keep this discussion going with a question from David Kiernan.
The National Housing Accord facility has aspirational plans to provide 10,000 new affordable housing dwelling for frontline workers. However, Build Skills Australia has identified that there is a need for 90,000 tradespeople in the next 3 months. How can this demand be met if there's insufficient housing?
Cameron, this is a really interesting one because we've got pretty high immigration numbers at the moment. I don't think anyone would dispute that. The government says they're going to go back down, but at the moment, and yet we've got this shortage of a particular kind of worker we need. Have we got the mix wrong?
A couple of things in response to your question. Firstly, the immigration outcome is a policy choice, and I'd be very interested to hear from the panel about that, considering we're all talking about supply and ignoring the demand. But on the skilled trades, look, we in the 2010s built a record number of dwellings, so I'm not sure that that is the case right now. We have actually been, in the last 3 years, using monetary policy to slow the economy and stop us building homes. So I think we're missing this fundamental sort of economic issue at play, that we want to slow the economy by putting interest rates up, and the main way that happens is to lower housing construction, at the same time open the borders essentially and have high immigration. So I'd be interested to hear more from the elected politicians of how they see that fitting together.
Well, Andrew Bragg, you mentioned immigration numbers in your first answer. What do you think the immigration numbers should be?
Well, I mean, it's going to be very hard for us to house our children if we're having, for every 4 people we bring in, we only build 1 house, and that's what we're doing at the moment. But I think thematically here, taking those 2 last questions, I mean, it's also going to be very hard to build the houses if we demonise the building, construction and property development sector. I mean, all that leaves is then the government to build the houses, which is what the Greens want, or the super funds. Right, which is what Labor want. I mean, Labor want the super funds and the foreign fund managers to build the houses. The Greens want the government to own all the houses, and we want the people to own the houses. And you need,
Andrew, you know,
and you need. Well,
Hang
you
on a minute,
You want the government to build the houses.
every single house.
We already build
Yeah,
houses.
you want the government to build the houses. That's your policy.
I can talk about the policy, but it's not every
Asking me to agree with Max here.
But the point is that how
This
are
is
you
going to get uncomfortable. Continue,
But
Andrew.
the point is, how are you going to get the people to own the houses without a private market, without the builders and the construction sector and the property managers? You need them.
So, are you in favour of the, 90,000 tradespeople coming in to do it?
Well, the only reason that we don't have enough tradespeople, I mean, one of the reasons is because Labor have closed off the visas for foreign tradespeople because their mates at the unions told them to close it off.
Right. That's just not right. So
Hang on a minute. We do have a high number of immigrants coming to the country at the moment. Labor has made announcements about trying to change that direction, but there is a shortage of tradespeople. Why?
So one of the challenges is we need to train more tradespeople. So fee-free TAFE has as it's one of its priority areas.
Yeah, but I'm
construction
talking about
workers.
now, people ready to build houses now.
Absolutely. So we've had 20,000 construction workers go through fee-free TAFE, and last year we brought in around 10,000 skilled migrants to work as construction workers. And there's a strong Australian history for this. The Snowy Mountains scheme is an exercise in bringing in builders from overseas.
Sure, 10,000 doesn't seem enough for the number that's needed though, right?
We need to keep on bringing in migrants who are targeted at skills shortage. The genius of the Australian migration scheme, and the reason it's historically had strong popular support, is that people are being brought in not to supplant existing workers, but in order to fill skills shortages. Migration is coming down to, in the next year, it'll be around half the level it was when we came to office. When we came to office, we had a system which Martin Parkinson, the former head of Prime Minister and Cabinet, said was broken. We set about rebuilding that system, making sure we got the settings right, making sure that the people who came in were filling skills shortages.
Okay.
And we do understand the importance of getting those workers.
Clarify, do you think, you said 10,000 last year, do you think that number has to rise?
Certainly we want to bring in as many of those skilled workers as the industry says we need.
But the industry's saying that 90,000 short to get to actually build the stuff we need to build. So will you bring those people
My
in?
first priority, Patricia, would be to train Australians to do the job.
But obviously there's a lag effect and there's a housing crisis now. This is the issue, isn't it?
There's going to be a lag in both of those. My priority would be to be training Australians to do the job. And there's other solutions we need to focus on at the same time. So Ed Husic brought the building ministers together last Friday to look at modular homes. Brendan O'Connor has been bringing the skills ministers together. And the housing ministers have gotten together 7 times since the last election. Let's be clear, for the last 5 years of the coalition government, the state and territory housing ministers never got convened once.
Okay, well,
we've got to
on that, today there was a housing ministers meeting, in fact, on this very fund. Are you happy with how the Commonwealth is handling this?
I'm happier, but no, I mean, I have to say, I love my comrade here on the panel, but I'm asking for more from the Commonwealth. And, you know, look, from a state perspective, no question we have to do more. No question we have to do more at the state level. And I'm not trying to shirk responsibility for the states when it comes to contributing our portion of the work that has to happen. But New South Wales, for every $1 we send to the Commonwealth in GST, we get 87 cents back. We've had our infrastructure funding cut. You know, we're struggling to get our fair share in health and education, and housing is core infrastructure.
So what more do you want on housing, Rose?
We want to see the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement double its contribution from the Commonwealth to the states. Now, that is not suggesting that the states don't also have to do more. I'm not saying...
So do you also double your contribution?
We have to lift as well. Absolutely.
You double it like you expect the Commonwealth to?
It's a 50-50 contribution.
Okay, and did you raise that today?
Absolutely.
And what happened?
No, it was we got a good hearing from Minister Collins. We don't have a funding envelope from the Commonwealth yet. I'm sure Andrew and Jim are working on that at the moment. No pressure. But the reality is, you know, vertical fiscal imbalance, we can talk wonky, it's Q&A. Most of the revenue is raised by the Commonwealth. That's the reality.
Okay.
Yes, the states have to
So how much
lift.
is currently being talked about, and what would you like it to be?
Look, we don't have figures yet, Patricia.
Give me an idea. I just like ideas.
No, we're talking billions. We're talking billions here. Billions of dollars need to be spent on this. And I make this point. State and Commonwealth governments don't bat an eyelid contributing billions of dollars to road and rail and bridges and other forms of infrastructure. Why is housing viewed differently to other forms of infrastructure? It's core infrastructure. So we are talking billions of dollars.
Okay. Cameron, do you think that would be a good investment?
I'm not 100% clear what you mean. Are you going to build houses?
Absolutely. We
Sounds
build
a lot like
houses
what
now.
Max said.
I know.
Yeah.
I mean, there are elements of the Greens policy. I want to say, Max, you don't need to set up a federal agency to deliver housing. We got some for you in the States, mate. We're ready to go.
But you're not building any. I mean, like,
we're not building enough.
Sure.
We're not building enough.
Can I jump in?
Yes,
Can I
please,
jump in?
Catherine.
Please, let me jump in. All right, this conversation is up here. Good public policy is formed on the basis of the experiences of people on the ground. All right, you want to talk about the rental crisis. If you are a young person, you cannot get into the rental market. If I could use Alice Springs as an example, always easiest for me, you're going up against 2 or 3 people who might be, if you're a family, you're renting against 2 or 3 professionals in a house who will outbid you every single time you try and get in. If you're a young person in your 20s and you're emerging into your job, you've got no chance of getting into the rental market, right? If we go on to thinking about things like our children, any room you go into that relates to child protection, it is in the first 3 things that people raise. In South Australia at this moment, the South Australian Children's Commission has just done a review of the number of children removed at birth. Now, this number in Australia for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children is the highest number of children removed. And I'm talking women who give birth and don't even get to hold their children. They are told that these children are going to be weighed and they do not come back again. The primary driver in that 80% in South Australia alone is housing or housing instability. Parents, mothers who could be awesome mothers are deemed to not be suitable parents because they are couch searching, because someone has made a determination that you are living in a house with too many people in it. Therefore, we're going to make a decision to take your children away. You want to talk about the infrastructure bit, right? We all know we need to get into early education and care. As the current policy settings mean, we do not build and we do not provide early education and care services in communities where there is no housing for teachers, where there is no housing for people who do not have jobs as determined by a diploma or a certificate or a university. And yet on all of those communities, there are people who can work. On all of those communities, there is housing that could be expanded. In all of the housing stock that governments have, there are houses that could be expanded, another wing built onto it, another granny flat put on the back of it. We are not looking at the stock, we are not looking at how we can move immediately where we have inappropriate housing that's not being used. If it's an upgrade to a kitchen, upgrade the kitchen. These things are no-brainers. They are easy to do, they would cost nothing, and that's how you get it done.
I'd like to bring in Dan McKenna. Hi, Dan.
Hi, my question is for Max. So I'm the CEO of not-for-profit housing developer called Nightingale Housing.
Love your work.
Thank you, thanks very much. Even after nearly a decade worth of projects, we are still facing difficulties in our attempts to create more well-designed, sustainable homes, even often from otherwise progressive local councillors who are often influenced by the NIMBY debate. My question to you is this: where do you and the Greens sit on the spectrum between NIMBYs and YIMBYs? And how do we convince those who are against medium density development to get on board for the greater good?
Yeah, great question. Look, I think the NIMBY debate is a bit of a false debate. Nightingale's a really good example. So just because everyone in the panel but me talks about...
What is a YIMBY and a NIMBY? Please explain to people watching, saying that's an acronym I'm not all...
Yeah, sorry. NIMBY not in my backyard, and YIMBY the opposite, yes.
Yes, in my backyard. It's a new movement. OK.
Everyone but me talked about the Greens public developer proposal.
If you could just directly answer the question.
This is directly answering the question. So the way to solve that issue is often what Nightingale has done, which is you build beautifully designed homes integrated into the local community, next to public infrastructure, where it's also affordable. There are a lot of communities I speak to who would support medium density developments in their area if they knew their children could afford to live in it. Like, we have a situation where construction workers building a lot of these huge, not Nightingale, but these huge private developments can't afford to live in it, which is exactly why, by the way, the Greens' proposal is what the Australian government did post-World War II.
OK, I just need to press you on that, because, Dan, you've said that you've actually faced hurdles, even though... Yeah, so that's not his experience. Can you just walk me through what's happened?
Yeah, I think probably... Yeah, down on the ground, kind of trying to get it done. It's harder than ever, and we're facing it from local, state, federal, all the politicians. Everyone's talking about it, but it does seem to be getting more and more difficult to get projects happening.
So do you stand with the... It's the YIMBYs, isn't it?
No, look, Pete...
Are you a yes in my backyard guy?
Oh, certainly to Nightingale, absolutely.
So what, you're selective about who it is?
If we had it... Well, yeah, of course, because we want it to be affordable, we want it to be well-designed, and we want it to be integrated into public infrastructure. Look... The point is, at a broader level, just to answer on the planning question, planning is not the major barrier to housing construction at the moment at a macro level. Even hardly an ally of the Greens, the Westpac chief economist, has pointed out we have a record number of approved developments that developers are not building. AV Jennings, for an example, a large developer, they have 11,000 approved lots. Just quickly, this is important on planning, but have only released 173 last year.
OK, but Max, there are local councils, and Greens are on them, that have stifled developments.
Well, actually,
do you oppose that?
Well, the Greens supported the Nightingale, the one that...
Actually, Dan said he had lots of issues over a long period of time.
Yeah, there was, ex-Greens councillors.
Ex-Greens, quite crucially. They're not in the Greens anymore.
I'll give you a list of Greens opposing development,
But planning is always brought up because politicians don't want to talk about building public housing.
Well,
they don't want to talk about
both of them because it all works together.
But planning is not the barrier to our housing crisis, and like immigration, it's a distraction used to avoid talking about the solutions we know have worked in the past.
I want to bring in some other people if I can. Andrew Bragg, is Max right? Is planning not an issue, or is it part of the story?
Well, I mean, it sounds like Max wants to decide who can build and who can't build. I mean, the reality is we've got a housing crisis. If someone wants to put up the money to build a big block of flats, they should be able to build the flats. If people want to build social and affordable housing, that's also an important part of the overall system. We just need, at this point, the most houses we can get safely constructed. I mean, that is the key thing. So, unfortunately, there have been a lot of councils that have vetoed developments. That's why it's very important that all tiers of government work together to highlight where there are bad judgments being made and people are not acting in the long-term interest of the country by stifling development.
Do you support this new medium density expansion?
I think it's a good idea.
Yeah?
I think it's the only way we're going to solve the problem in the big cities.
OK. That's interesting. Cameron, do you think it's a solution?
No, I think... How would I put it? It's great that people care about what's happening in their area. I think there are plenty of outdated planning rules and cumbersome ones that should be updated, so I'm definitely on side there. But if you zoom out and look at the cities and look at the patterns of development over time, what you find is that when the market rises, we can build double, triple the number of dwellings that we did. When the market falls, somehow we stop. So what's regulating the pace of development, regardless of the density and the location, is the market conditions. And that's why construction's falling off now. We're orchestrating a decline in that by putting interest rates up so people don't spend so much on housing. That's what we're trying to do. And I think we're missing some of the important dilemmas in the debate here. In talking about the landlord, was it Anne-Marie? Your question, we're missing this tension between the availability of houses for homeowners and the rents people pay and the incomes of landlords. And we're missing this tension between managing the macroeconomy and being able to buy a house, because the way we manage the macroeconomy is to make it expensive to buy a house. And so I think this is why, housing is such a difficult question, and I think I'm very supportive of, we can at any time build a house for anyone we want and rent or sell it to them at any price we want. And I'm surprised that that is not the first thing we talk about.
OK. Andrew, I'll give you a quick response before I get to the next question.
Yeah, Dan, I think as an economist, planning and zoning is fundamental. We need to get be pushing more on this front. And if you look at experts, whether it's Ed Glazer in the US, whether it's the Grattan Institute here, whether it's somebody like Peter Tulip, it's very clear from those experts that planning and zoning is one of the reasons why we've seen housing affordability steadily slip away for so many Australian households.
OK.
I'm sorry, that's just not true. That is not true.
What's not true about it?
That planning is the reason that house prices are so expensive.
No. Planning is part of the reason.
No, it's not. It's just not.
It's not part of... Wait.
No.
I have to ask you a clear question. You're saying it has nothing to do with it?
Almost nothing to do when you compare it with, say, something like the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing. When the capital gains tax was introduced, discount was introduced by Howard in about 1999. Before that, house prices used to go up at about the same price as wages. After that, they went up at 3 times the rate of wages. The idea that there's this sort of magical set of property developers, if only they were allowed to build enough homes to bring down the price of housing. Does anyone seriously think that the only reason that property developers are not building so many homes to bring down the price of housing is because of the planning system?
I don't think anyone is saying it's not the only. I think there's the argument here that there's a combination of factors.
I'd love to hear from international examples, because, of course, Andrew's referred to a number of eminent economists, as of course he would, but I would refer to places like Auckland and Minneapolis and actual cities in this actual world that have actually changed planning laws, and that has actually resulted in lower rents or lower growth in rent. So sure, as I said at the beginning, I am in no way an advocate of saying fix the planning system and the housing will come. Of course, it's more complicated than that. But this dismissive idea that the current complex and cumbersome planning system is not a genuine and significant, not the only, but genuine and significant barrier is wrong and is not the experience that is had on the ground by people genuinely trying to build homes like Nightingale, like state governments. As a minister who is responsible for building social and affordable housing in the state, I find the planning system to be a genuine barrier to the delivery of the social and affordable homes that we are funding.
Cameron's laughing because she's studied Auckland and it's not...
Cameron, I'll give you a quick reply, but I want to get to the next question.
Did I read in the paper that you've postponed 3,500 public houses in New South Wales today? Is that...
No. Nice try, mate. We have resurrected a policy for the former government cancelled. So get your facts right before you want to have a go.
3,000, how many is it building now?
Sorry?
How many is it building now?
So the former government had a redevelopment proposal at Riverwood. This is getting into the details.
And this is a national audience.
That's right. But no, it's absolutely nonsense to suggest that the New South Wales government is cancelling proposals to build public housing. In fact, we are resurrecting proposals that were cancelled by the previous government.
All right. If you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A Live with Catherine Liddle, Cameron Murray, Andrew Leigh, Rose Jackson, Andrew Bragg and Max Chandler-Mather. What a night. Plenty to get to. Here's the CEO of Homelessness Australia, Kate Colvin.
Thank you. I've got a simple question for the politicians on the panel. Can you tell us how much homelessness do you think is acceptable in a wealthy country like Australia and what you plan to do about it?
I'll start with you, Andrew Bragg.
Well, there shouldn't be any, but I mean, ultimately what's happened here is that the lack of supply has led to a spike in prices, which has meant that it's had a result of having more people living rough because housing has been made to be unaffordable for too many. So when we talk about what needs to happen in the short term, it is very important that we do resolve the supply issues. And of course, there is an important tradition in this country about the provision of public housing, and there's no reason that state governments can't build more public housing. In fact, right now we are at a historical low, but it's not the solution for all people, as you know, in your role at homelessness. But I think that's the answer, that effectively, if you build the houses, you can solve this problem in large part.
Okay, Andrew Leigh.
First of all, I just want to say thanks for the work that Homelessness Australia does. I know how life-changing it can be. I remember in my electorate when we opened a facility called Common Grounds, chatting to a bloke who'd been sleeping rough for a decade, and just, it was almost like he was in another world to be in a place of his own. That's the life-changing impact of finding someone a home. So thank you for that work.
And the question was how much homelessness is acceptable?
And the answer is, of course, zero. But the practical question is how we get there. When we came to office, we set about putting in place a national homelessness plan, which hadn't existed for a long time, bringing together the states and territories and putting billions of dollars into a social housing accelerator. Minister Julie Collins was in this city last week, opening a couple of hundred houses for social and affordable access, and also making sure we got the design specifications right. I've been at facilities where suddenly a person with a disability is able to move about through that home because we've done things like not putting a lip on the shower and making sure that there's mobility ramps through it. Simple design features make sure that we're creating the homes that people need to move from homelessness into housing.
Look, I want to bring in Paige Forrester if I can. Hi, Paige.
There.
I'd love it if you could share your story with us because you've actually lived through homelessness.
Yeah.
Tell us what happened.
Yeah, I was about 15 when my mum and I first experienced homelessness. And by the time I was 18, I'd lived in a motel, 2 share houses, which probably wasn't legal, couch surfed, lived in transitional housing, and finally got public housing, which I eventually had to leave because of family violence and safety concerns. I knew a transfer could take years and wasn't guaranteed. I'm now renting privately and experiencing the stress of my rent going up, but my wages staying the same. And if my rent keeps increasing, I won't be able to afford this particular property. The right to adequate housing is a human right recognised in international human rights law, but in Australia, well over 100,000 people are homeless and nearly 18,000 of those are children. At the moment, nationally, no rentals are considered affordable for the lowest income households. With my own history and work as a case manager in crisis accommodation, I know how close anyone is to homelessness.
Catherine, that's a familiar story for you.
It's a familiar story, and again, the conversation we've been having has been sitting up here. What we also know is people experiencing homelessness have actually probably more than likely come out of things like the child protection system. And if you look, it's there. And if you go back even further, that's where you've had the lack of infrastructure and support services like your early childhood services, like your maternal health services and all those sorts of things. And when you look at what and again, this is a cautionary tale because this is about bringing voice to what people actually experience on the ground. Medium density housing, yeah, that's a good idea. However, understand that when you when you increase the number of houses in any particular area, and this is something that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people experience all the time because we go, oh, there's a problem, let's build another house there. Do you actually have the medical services available? Right. What is going to happen to your public schools when the numbers double? What is it like when you're a parent to drop your child off at a public school when twice the number of cars are now driving past that school? So those things also need to be taken into account and often are overlooked. But getting back to the crisis, we know that the majority of again, if we're looking at domestic violence, that's a massive causation of homelessness. So is poverty. There is nowhere for families fleeing domestic violence to land. These things, they're a short-term solution because you need to also be looking at what the underlying causes are. But in the short term, people have nowhere to go when things have gone wrong. And as a general rule, something has gone wrong further down the track. So when we're talking about homelessness, it's not only having houses available to land in, it's about addressing what causes it in the first place.
And the ABC is running an investigation into strata across Australia, apartment owners and body corporates, strata managers and regulators. Those are the perspectives that are crucial to understanding how the system works. If you want to share your story, go to abc.net.au/strata because we're doing a big investigation into that. We have a question now from Crystal Mountford.
By allowing first home buyers the ability to dip into super, wouldn't this just cause prices to be pushed even higher?
Andrew Bragg.
Well, of course, the super industry, like Dracula with the blood bank, that they want to keep all your money under lock and key for 40 years. So, of course, they've published this absolute rubbish research which says that the sky will fall in and everyone's house will cost a lot more money. But the reality is that most of the credible economists like Cameron Murray and other people who may have featured on these panels before would say that it would only have a very small change to the prices. But the
But it would
reality
be slightly inflationary, wouldn't it?
could be, but the reality is that for many people, particularly older millennials, super might be their biggest pool of capital. So absent the bank of mum and dad, which is now a very large lender in Australia, denying people access to that capital may mean that those Australians never become homeowners. And the single biggest determinant of your success in retirement is not your super balance, it's your home ownership status. So I think it's a conversation worth having. Labor and the unions and all the other super Draculas don't like it because, of course, they take lots of money from the scheme, but I think it's an important discussion for us to have.
Cameron, do you think it's a good idea?
Yeah. Do you want me to just explain why it's not going to boost prices? So we had first homeowners grants, and when I first bought a house, that was $7,000. Now, if you didn't buy a house, you got zero. If you did buy it, you got $7,000. But if you use super to buy a house and you don't buy a house this year, you still have that money and it probably grows in your super for next year. So there's no sort of pressure to you spend it. It's not free money, whereas the first homeowners grants have been free money, which is why they had direct price effects. So, yeah, I don't think it's unreasonable to use your super to buy a house to live in when you can already use your super to buy houses for other people to live in.
Okay.
Seems to make sense to me.
Crystal, if I can go back to you, would you use your super to buy a house?
To be honest with you, that just answered my second part of the question, because basically I feel that with first home owners grants, when they have gone up, the market's risen as well. But you have said that the investment of the money in the meantime mitigates that.
But would you use your super to do it?
Sorry?
Would you use your own super to do something like that?
I think I would have, yeah.
Yep.
A lot of people did. So don't forget, we had record first home buying in the financial year 2021, about 166,000 compared to about 90,000 per year in the 5 years prior. And part of that was because people got their super out during COVID. And I think that's worked for a lot of people. It's brought forward a lot of buying and it's given people security.
Okay. Andrew Bragg, thanks for your thumbs up.
That's all right.
But you're actually proposing getting more of that money and allowing people to put it in their mortgage offset accounts, is that right?
Well, we're very focused on trying to make sure that people own houses. So one of the interesting stats now is that a lot of people are retiring or getting the preservation age at age 60 and using their super to pay off their mortgage. So therefore, we've forced people to pay all this interest to banks for years and years when people could have owned their own house faster. So it seems crazy to force people to pay all these high fees to the super company over here, then over here charge or pay a high level of interest to a bank. If people can just offset their debt with their own super, then they own their house faster, and that might be the best thing for them to do. So my view is, why not let people choose?
Okay. Can I just ask you, I know this is one idea that you're floating. Do you also think that all the tax incentives for housing and investment issues need to be on the table for discussion as well?
Well, I don't think increasing taxes is going to build a single house.
No, I didn't say increasing taxes. I mean, one of your colleagues, Keith Wallahan, told me that, you know, all of these things need to be looked at to see whether these investment mechanisms in housing were distorting the market. Do you think it's worth looking at?
No, I don't.
Why not?
Well, because, I mean, the research here shows that playing around with negative gearing and capital gains might only change house prices by between 1% and 4% anyway. So it's only a marginal issue. I don't agree with Max. I respect his, policy advocacy, but I don't agree with him. So I would be focused on building more houses and letting people use their super on the demand side.
Okay. Andrew?
I just don't understand why the Liberals' answer to housing affordability is that millennials should be poorer in retirement. Crystal,
come on.
I look at this policy.
They're poor now, right?
I look at this policy and I see what happened during the global financial crisis when the Liberals allowed people to rip billions of dollars out of their superannuation, and for every dollar they ripped out, they missed out on the compounding returns, making them a couple of dollars, $3, $4, $5 poorer in retirement.
So what's your point? They're poor anyway.
It's true for every dollar that you don't save, whether it's in super or not, right? And most retired homeowners are the most financially stable of all groups. Young families renting are the least financially stable.
So
surely they should have their own money at that point in time.
So the Super Members Australia modelling of this suggests it'll push up house prices by 9%. Respected economist Saul SNAICC calls it, if we went ahead with it, the worst public policy decision of the 21st century. Malcolm Turnbull, Peter Dutton have come out against it for very good reason. When you simply fuel the demand side, and when you're putting in place a policy which wouldn't help the people who most need the assistance, who tend to have lower superannuation balances, then all you're going to do is fuel an overinflated housing market. We need to focus on the supply solutions. Okay. That's what the government's doing, not playing around with approaches that are going to make millennials choose between getting a house now and having a dignified retirement.
And we can bring you the results of our online poll now. We asked you, should first home buyers be able to draw down from superannuation to get into the housing market? Almost 6,300 of you responded. Here's how you voted. 32% said yes, 59% said no, 9% were unsure. Interesting. Now let's have a listen to the question from Vishwa Liengay.
The Bank of Mum and Dad has become a financial institution that will only grow more influential over time. Everyone seems to acknowledge that it's there, but there doesn't seem to be anyone who acknowledges how influential it is. What options or hope does the panel have for younger Australians who do not have access to this bank?
Max.
Yeah, great question. And effectively what we've got now, increasingly, is a feudal system where if your parents are wealthy enough, then bam, you get a home. And there'll be parents listening to this right now, teachers, cleaners, people who feel sad, maybe even a bit guilty about the fact that they can't help their kid buy a home. And my message for them, it is not your fault. It is not your fault. But what it is the fault of, to be frank, and again, we just keep talking about tinkering around the edges. Let's be very clear. The biggest increase in home ownership in Australian political history was post-World War II. And guess what we did then? We capped rent increases. We built, in the first 10 years after 1945, 100,000 public homes. And guess what we did? We rented them and sold them to people for below market prices, what the Greens are proposing to do now. And we didn't have the capital gains tax discount. Now, and we didn't have a tax system that encouraged people to treat housing as a huge lucrative investment. Andrew, you said before that you don't want to inflate demand. But that's an argument against negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount, which, by the way, will cost the federal budget billions and billions of dollars, inflating demand for property investors. And my message to you is, unless both major political parties come back to the major three solutions that work, mass build of public housing, capping rent increases so people like Paige don't have to cop unfair rent increases that might push her again into homelessness. And again, I note that no major party will address the fact that the major reason people are going into homelessness is because of increasing rents. 58% of people accessing homelessness services, guess what they say? It's because of housing costs. So we can fix that for a start and deal with the tax system. And let's be real, we can have all the other kooky solutions we want. Until we do those three things and go back to what we did in the 20th century, we're not going to fix this housing crisis.
Rose.
I'm not going to be lectured by the Greens about kooky solutions.
Which one's kooky?
Sorry, PK.
No, do you think everything should be on the table? Would you like to see your federal colleagues look at capital gains tax concessions, negative gearing, all of it?
Yeah, so I am for everything on the table. Here's one thing that I won't do, which is take the easy route for a state politician and say, oh, well, actually, it's the Commonwealth's problem. They have to fix their tax system in immigration, or it's just actually local government. We need to change the way individual DAs are assessed. Both of those abdicate the responsibility that I have as a state politician to play a role and control the things that I can control. So sure, yes, I encourage every level of government to take seriously the responsibilities that they have. And that requires me to do the same. So as a state politician, in answer to your question, I absolutely agree that the current arrangements, as we said in answer to the very first question, are unfair. It is unfair that unless you have access to money through your family, through your parents, you're essentially locked out of the housing market. And we have to change that. And my strong view is that it is the delivery of more affordable housing that is the fundamental answer to that. And there is a role for the planning system in that. There is also a role, as I've said, for governments, state and federal, to contribute more money into delivering more social and affordable housing, direct intervention into that portion of the market. So we need to lift overall
Andrew,
stock and that
I hear from Rose that she says she doesn't want to sort of shirk her responsibility. So on to yours. You know, you have a key role. You could advocate for a wholesale look at all of the different policies and the levers. Why not do it?
Absolutely. Well, to Vishwa's question directly, I'm concerned that the Bank of Mum and Dad simply doesn't work for a lot of young Australians. So we've got a program called Help to Buy, which is a shared equity scheme modelled on the successful schemes like Keystart in Western Australia, which operated under Labor and Liberal government.
Sure, it's 10,000 places though, right?
But it's 10,000 targeted places. The green scheme would be eligible, anybody in this panel would be eligible. This one is tightly targeted by income range to those who need it most. Help to Buy is currently being held up in the Senate by the Liberals and by the Greens. It's a shared equity scheme that can work, which allows people to get into home ownership with a deposit as low as 2%, with the Commonwealth going in as a shared equity partner and the ability to buy out the Commonwealth down the track.
Okay.
We know it can work. We've seen it work at the state level, and it directly, Vishwa, gets to that problem that you've talked about, that many people cannot rely on their parents to get into the market, and the Commonwealth is there to step up if only the Liberals and the Greens will stop blocking.
Vishwa, it was a really good question. But I suppose when you're talking about disadvantaged people, there is no bank of mum and dad.
There is no bank of mum and dad, and for Aboriginal
and that
Torres
mum and
Strait
dad
Islander
also
people,
didn't have a bank.
Absolutely, they didn't have a bank, so there is absolutely nothing. So if you are lucky enough to have a bank and mum and dad, that is awesome. But again, we're not looking broad enough at this problem, because if you come from a family where there is a bank of mum and dad, there's a pretty good chance if you went to uni, your HECS fees were also paid. So are we also looking at those things that reduce our ability to spend? If education was free, oh my goodness, how much money would young people have in order to be able to start investing?
That sounds like a whole other episode. Andrew Bragg. You know, the Liberal Party used to talk about being the party of home ownership. You've been made the the shadow minister for home ownership, but that's declined under your watch too. The Bank of Mum and Dad has thrived under your watch when you're in government too, hasn't it?
Well, I think the millennials and Gen Zs are on a pathway that we don't want to see. We want to see younger Australians own a house because that is the foundation for their financial success.
But do you take responsibility for how this built up?
Look, I think there's been a lack of supply for the last few years. Obviously, the issues are much more acute now under the current government, but I understand you're trying to make
I just think it's a longer-running
broader
problem.
point, and I accept that. And my point is we want younger Australians to get access to housing because that is the key to their financial future. It's not another scheme or another government program. I think housing is at the centre of what we can do for young people, and that's why we're very committed to it.
And to finish tonight's discussion, here's a question from Annika Naring.
Thanks. Do you think housing prices should go down?
Oh, great question.
A little, yeah. Well, how much?
No.
I guess.
How much? How?
So, it's such a good question.
It is.
Because house prices don't usually go down outside of recessions and depressions. And when they do, like we thought they might during COVID, we turn around, we drop interest rates, we subsidise people to get them back up. So that's the dilemma, and I think it's the same dilemma we've sort of hit on many times, and that's why I support schemes like Max's and getting people non-market options for housing, because everyone said they want more supply, but does that mean you want to supply enough to push prices down, and by how much? I think maybe that's part of the question.
Yeah.
I like the question.
I did too, because it's so direct, right? Andrew Bragg, should house prices go down?
Well, I think that if you build the supply you need and you don't have migration, which is unsustainable, then that's what will happen.
So you're saying house prices will go down?
Well, it's very possible that if you actually...
And you'd like them to, right?
Well, I'm relaxed about how the market decides how it will price things, but if you do it properly, then the natural consequence is that it will.
Annika?
With respect to the supply side of things, if all of the houses being built are luxury apartments and luxury homes, house prices will never really go down and I won't be able to buy a home. Even with Help to Buy, I would be in mortgage stress if I were to enter a mortgage.
So it's about the kind of housing that's getting built, right? Okay, simple. We haven't got long on the show left. Catherine, should house prices go down?
Yeah, it is. You're right. It's a tough one, but I was thinking
it is for the people who have their properties and don't want it to happen.
Absolutely, and our house price has gone down. So I suspect in regional and remote areas, housing prices has gone down because of the stresses that sit around the housing issue in the first place. So as a homeowner, I like it when my home is worth a little bit more, but I would certainly do anything to see my children be able to get into a home. So if that means making them more affordable so that my children have a future, I would like to see a way to do that balanced both. I don't have the solution, so thankfully I don't sit in politics. I just get to give you headaches. There's still time. No.
Andrew Leigh, do you want to see house prices go down?
Annika, I think it's a great question. My view is that if we put all of the solutions into play, the best we're going to be able to do is moderate the growth in house prices.
Would you like to see the moderation of house prices really slow significantly, which is the case that Alan Kohler was making?
Absolutely, absolutely. And partly affordability is also about increasing wages. We'll put in a submission to the Fair Work Commission this week arguing for a wage increase for minimum wage workers off the back of the push we've made for raising wages for aged care workers and other essential workers. But at the same time, we've got to be building those extra homes, working with the states and territories and ending the blame game in housing, but collaborating with states and territories. Where Julie Collins has gotten the ministers together seven times, that's provided an impetus to deal with the supply issue and to try and get our way back to an Australia where home ownership is part of the Aussie dream.
Rose?
We absolutely have to moderate the growth in house prices. I accept that. $1.6 million for a median house price in Sydney is unacceptable. Even if we did that, it's not going to be enough. We have to directly deliver supply into social and affordable housing in the market. That is the only way that particularly vulnerable people and low-income people are going to have access to stable housing. So, yes, we have to moderate house growth, but we also have to directly supply social and affordable housing.
Max, final word to you.
Stopping house growth is a great idea. And just to be direct about it, and everything...
House price growth?
Yeah.
Not house growth.
No,
house growth.
Sure, stop house
He doesn't think supply is an
growth.
issue.
I'm sure the Labor Party would clip that otherwise. And the way to achieve that, none of the announcements there from the major parties will do that, because they are not touching the tax handouts for property investors. And just on public housing, we have a shortage of 710,000 public and community homes across the country. Even if you take into account every commitment made by every state and territory government and the federal government, that shortage will keep going up. It is increasing faster than governments are building it because they're not building public housing the way we used to, which is why we've proposed building 360,000 public homes made available to all sorts of people, middle-income workers, the way this country used to.
That's all we have time for. Thanks to our panel, Catherine Liddle, Cameron Murray, Andrew Leigh, Rose Jackson, Andrew Bragg and Max Chandler-Mather. Thank you for sharing your stories and your questions. This year, Q&A will be running in seasons. We will be back on air for the next season on Monday, the 29th of April. I hope you can join us then. Have a safe Easter. Good night.